Good afternoon and welcome to this session on commitment in construction, where we will explore why construction projects go wrong, trace those project problems back to the contract, and get some tips on how to do it better next time. Our panel members have got a wealth of experience in the construction industry, and they're passionate about improving the construction industry. So I can promise you that this is going to be a lively and thought-provoking discussion. Andy and Sarah, I'm going to start with the big one. Andy, coming to you first. What do you think is the chief cause of disputes in the construction industry globally?
Thank you, Suzannah, and hello, everyone. It's not really what I think, because it's much more learned bodies than I am, including HKA and Arcadis. Arcadis, I have some notes here. HKA have produced their report over the past 2 years, Claims and Dispute Causation, and Arcadis, their Global Construction Dispute Report, which has been issued every year for several years now. And if I may, I would like to read from their latest findings of the chief causes of disputes in our industry. Firstly, contract requirements were poorly drafted. Number 2, errors or omissions in the contract documents. Number 3, contract management and or contract administration failures. Failure to serve appropriate notices under the contract. The parties failing to understand or comply with its contractual obligations. Claims were spurious, overinflated, opportunistic, and or unsubstantiated. And finally, the poor level of skill and or experience when it comes to dealing with contractual matters. Now, notably, the scathing reports from both these global companies don't include design problems, so we're good as an industry at design. They don't include engineering problems, and they don't include construction problems. So the problems all arise around contractual matters, contractual drafting, and contract management and administration.
I see you nodding there, Sarah. You agree?
Well, I do. I think, the sector as a whole globally is good at what they do technically and commercially, but I think that contracts aren't helping the parties do business, and that's the whole purpose of a contract. So if you summarised all those things, it's basically the parties can't read them. If they read them, they can't understand them. And when they do read and they try and understand them, they can't apply them in practice. Most of the contract forms that we have globally aren't actually designed to positively encourage the clients and the users to read them and to be able to implement them. They don't have flow charts, they don't have visuals, they don't have guidance. If you want to know about a contract, you have to either read a book or their own guidance notes. That's kind of a bit of a sign that maybe the contracts are failing in their primary purpose of being a useful tool.
One other point you had there on the list, Andy, was around administering the contract. So rather than the contract itself. So who's responsible for administering the contract?
From the contractor's point of view, he has to manage and administer his obligations under the contract. So that's one side of it. On the other side, it is generally, let's look at employers, clients, owners, call them what you will. They fall into 2 categories. They may be experienced construction or involved in construction quite frequently, such as government departments, property developers, etc., etc. Or they may be a one-off construction client who wants a new factory building, a new building, a house building, whatever. Now, in the second category, that inexperienced clients rely on consultants that they pay to manage the contract on their behalf. And even when the project is a government project, or the client is a property developer or someone experienced in the construction industry, they still appoint what is usually a consultant to act as the contract administrator, engineer, architect, employer's representative, and they are responsible for administering the contract on the employer's behalf.
Sarah, is there anything we could do differently in the contracts to assist that?
Well, there are a number of things we can do. First of all is to try and make sure that our contracts represent what we do in practice, rather than trying to be too prescriptive. I know that the FIDIC 2017 has got 50% longer, weighs a lot more, and actually has got quite prescriptive in its processes, to try and encourage the parties to actually follow a specific procedure. But there's another line of thinking that says if you give parties enough rope, they'll actually tie themselves in knots rather than actually follow it to the very end. So in some respects, we need an actually objective contract administrator. And I know one of the things that Andy was talking about was these contract administrators appointed by the clients. Well, it's difficult to be objective when your next paycheck always comes from one side of the equation. So contract administrators often aren't well trained as part of their, underlying professional qualifications, and then don't get specific training before they have to pick up a contract and follow it. And they also have to deal with all the people shouting on either side about commercial, technical, organizational issues, as well as the legal issues. Most of these contract administrators aren't legally qualified. Why would they be? But they actually have to deal with quite a legal document and administer it. Most of those contracts don't have any sort of color coding or swim lanes or anything to identify where the contract administrator takes a pivotal role. So there's quite a lot, certainly in the UK where I practice, there's quite a lot of case law which adds into, the depth and nuance of what they have to do, which most contract administrators haven't got a handle on at all. So maybe we could just make their role a little bit easier by simplifying it to make it easy to know who has to do what, where, when, how, and the basis on which they can make decisions. Then we might find that contractors and clients, as much as they don't like the decisions, actually understand the rationale and then go with them, rather than sort of this friction that happens where they don't like something and it kind of builds and mothballs as the project proceeds.
All right, so we're making it much clearer as to what their roles and then their responsibilities are. So, where you've got a contract administrator who's got different hats, if you like, it's clear in the contract.
Yeah, because the contract administrators effectively always have two hats on. One of them is acting as agent for the client. Whether they're a sophisticated client or unsophisticated client, they still have to pass on instructions, information, verification, validation issues, and go through processes with the contractor. That's an agency role. But they also have this quasi-judicial sort of tribunal role where they make decisions about how much time, how much money, whether it's a variation, and that kind of thing. And that's a really difficult line to tread, to be both partisan in one time, and then the next week you've got to be completely independent. NEC tried to do this a little bit in its contract, but most contracts don't really clarify which of those hats the contract administrator is wearing for each of those tasks.
I wonder if sometimes it's seen as not in the interests of the client, perhaps, to be too specific about that sort of split of responsibilities. And I say that just from my own experience sitting in the Middle East. It's certainly rarely clear where those boundaries are. But I don't know, what do you think, Andy?
It was some good points there, Sarah. I'm not quite sure if I agree with you 100%, though. I do believe that the common forms of contract in use, would be the JCT, ICE, NEC, and my speciality, which is FIDIC, are reasonably well set out. They're all written by engineers for engineers. But I do agree, I also agree with you, and going back to Arcadis and HKA, one of the big problems is the level of skill and experience. So we put competent designers on the project, we put competent commercial people, quantity surveyors, we put competent engineers to build the project, but when it comes to handling contractual matters, in my experience, it's, oh, the QS can handle that. The project controls guy can do that. They will not, contractors or contract administrators don't like spending money on contract admin. And this is the result. We have many, many disputes because it's handled incorrectly. To go back to your point, Suzannah, and again, I've lived and worked in the Middle East for many, many years. Yes, I think there is a propensity for engineers and employers, not just employers, to blur the contract, to make it grey, to make it so it can be interpreted in one of two ways. And that means that if something happens, well, we didn't mean that, we meant something else. And that is just poor contract drafting. If I may make a point here, is that, you know, we've talked so far about administration during the life cycle of the construction phase of the project, when the contractor's on board. But I see a big problem in the drafting of the contracts in the first place, whether we've got a standard form, which we then draft particular conditions of contract to change things or add things. And in my experience, and I have worked during the design phase, is that with the people responsible for drafting and preparing the contract documents are generally the designers, possibly project managers. And whilst they might be able to design fantastic, iconic buildings, engineer them, make them work, do all the cost plans and the rest of it, when it comes to drafting the contract conditions, it is generally, and again, this is in my experience, someone in a sort of a junior role who doesn't really do that all the time, is not qualified. And I'm not saying that they need to have a degree in construction law, because that's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. But many of them don't have a good command of the English language. And I'm sorry, we do work internationally, but it's very important that the contract is interpreted properly. So when drafting conditions, they have to be perfect. So we put all this effort, time and money into employing competent, well-qualified, skilled people in certain aspects for our project. But when it comes to the contracts, it's almost an afterthought. And it's getting the contracts right at the beginning, before the job is out to tender, which will avoid many, many claims and many, many disputes.
Yeah, I agree, Andy. I think the way a contract is put together and drafted can avoid a lot of avoidable disputes. Can't avoid everything. For example, most contracts haven't dealt with the pandemic very well. So that was something we weren't expecting, and we couldn't really, tie it all up neatly. But actually, the way a contract is put together and the way it is drafted can make a massive difference to the number of disputes. And not just the massive disputes, the multi-million-pound headline winning disputes, but the little bits of friction that we see every day on a project, which makes such a difference to the relationship between the parties, because those elements of friction can kind of start to create a bit of a barrier, a bit of an atmosphere. It can result in ambiguous contracts, particularly, can result in one side gaming the contract for their advantage, rather than kind of taking a collaborative, mutual spirit of trust and cooperation approach. They see that the contract has sort of tied them up in knots, and they then spot something that they can go, oh, I think we can, make some money on this project. Whereas surely what we all want on a project is the outcome that the client wants, and the contractor to get a fair value, fair price for doing that work, because the client is going to get the benefit of the outcome for many, many years, maybe decades. The contractor only has one opportunity to make a profit. So we should actually have contracts that reflect that sort of balance of interests.
If I may interject here, I've seen it on several occasions whereby the client, the employer, is an honourable body, person, whatever, and in various situations, once the client has become aware of how the consultant that he's appointed to administer the contract is treating the contractor, underpaying him, not certifying due amounts on an interim basis, trying to get away from paying for variations, not dealing with claims properly. The client has said, why are you treating my contractor like this? Yeah, because the client actually realizes that if you don't treat the contractor equitably in accordance with the terms that the client signed up to, he is in breach of contract. So it's the client that's telling his contract administrator to pull the finger out and start playing ball properly for the benefit of the project.
Would the answer there then, Andy, be in taking a contract like the FIDIC 2017, because it's very prescriptive? So there's less room for the engineer to have his own interpretation of how to treat the contractor. What do you think?
I think when I first looked at FIDIC 2017, I thought the same as many other people thought. And I went to the launch of the 2017 editions in London. And when I picked it up and couldn't carry it, I thought, whoa, what's happening here? But having a little plug here, I'm almost completing a book about 2017 FIDIC. But having examined it in detail, I don't think, many people said this just needs more contract administration. It needs us spending more on contract management on the project, whether we're contractors or engineers, contract administrators, employers' representatives. Having examined it and got into it in detail, I disagree. What FIDIC said here is in 1999, we gave you some rules to work to, people. You didn't do it, you didn't act professionally, and now we've got all these disputes. So in 2017, we've been more prescriptive about the procedures that you need to follow, which you should have followed anyway. And we've now introduced consequences that if the engineer, for example, doesn't respond to a contractor's claim within, can't remember now, so let's say 42 days, I think it's 42 days, the claim is deemed to be rejected, and then the contractor can go to the next step to get his claim resolved. So I think FIDIC's done a good job. On the face of it, it looks difficult. When you get into it, I think it's a good thing for the industry. It's forcing the industry to do what they should have been doing anyway, and hopefully we'll avoid all these 7 reasons for disputes in the future.
Thank you. Sarah, Andy mentioned consequences there, and FIDIC 2017 includes more by way of consequence. Now, not thinking about FIDIC particularly, but more generally, do contracts deal with risk and consequence, or risk and compensation adequately, or is that an area that sort of maybe lends itself to disputes too?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think everyone assumes that the standard forms have got risks clearly set out. But with any standard form, it can only be a generic set of risks, and for every project, there's a really bespoke set of risks. So some contracts recognise the use of a project risk register, and they think, oh, well, the project risk register therefore deals with all the very specific things for this project that aren't covered in the standard form. But then quite a lot of them don't find a way of weaving the risk register correctly into the obligations and responsibilities of the parties. So you end up with sort of 2 parallel, maybe slightly diverging sets of rules for risks. And FIDIC is a good example of where, in order to find out how you're going to get extra time and money, you actually have to go through quite a lot of the clauses, because in no place does it list them all out. I'm sure Andy's book will, and other textbooks on these contracts do list out all the events which entitle you to more time or more money, depending how the contract is structured. But for a lot of people, that means that they do have to do quite a lot of work to find out how they should have priced it. And let's face it, as Andy was saying, quite often the contract comes too late for the pricing. So the parties have already started their relationship. And then somebody goes, oh, yeah, sort of as a bit of an afterthought, we just thought we'd let you have the contract. Well, changing the risk profile in that contract by the amendments, or butchering as some of the lawyers do, can actually really massively change what sort of pricing the contractor should have done. And that can start the whole project off on a back foot. It seems to me that if you want the contractor to accept a risk, it should be clear, open, upfront, part of the tender process. That's the best way for you to understand what they're pricing in and what they're not. And I've spoken to contractors who've accepted contracts reluctantly, just sort of at the door of the opening of the site, just because they knew they had to get one in place. But when they had a bit of time to look at it, realised that actually the risk profile was not what they expected. But because it had been badly drafted, there was another way they could recoup their sort of expected losses. So I think being clear on the risk, reward, the responsibility and roles of all the parties in a project is critical to setting up a good culture, a relationship, a way that you're going to share information rather than hide information. And that actually sets the project off on the right foot right at the beginning.
And Andy, I don't know if you've got anything there in the defence of FIDIC or anything that you found as you've been writing your book. Perhaps that it should be left alone.
I think FIDIC has made improvements in 2017. There is a lot more description, a lot more prescriptive requirements. I think the roles and the obligations are now defined. And as I said earlier, there are consequences now, more deeming provisions. So this means that if, for example, the engineer doesn't respond within a certain period to, for example, the submission of the design drawings, he is deemed to have given a notice of acceptance or approval of or no objection. So I think we're going in the right direction there. But, you know, I totally agree with what Sarah said. If we get off on the wrong foot at the beginning of the project, it bodes very, very badly for the next 2 years, 3 years, for everyone. People are trying to point fingers, people are trying to score points. What we should be doing, is getting on with building the building to the right time, to the right program, to the right cost and to the right quality, not spending time arguing, having consents and employing lawyers to get us out of big disputes because we've dug big holes for ourselves. Sorry, Suzannah, I do appreciate you are a lawyer.
Thank you. That's absolutely fine. I'm going to move you away now from that contract point and talk a bit more about minimising claims, perhaps more during the currency of projects. So, Sarah, you mentioned COVID and that being a disruption that we didn't expect. And it has caused many, if not most, projects to be delayed. How do you think those delay claims are going to be resolved?
Well, I think the difficulty for a lot of these projects to start off with is that the contractor is going to have to establish that they will be delayed. Now, I think it would, it's blindingly obvious to anyone in the sector that the way that people are required to work, local lockdowns, supply chain issues and everything else is going to reduce productivity, make it harder to get materials and resources. So that's not what the contractor contracted for. The scenario, the economic circumstances and all the logistical circumstances they had in mind when they agreed these terms no longer apply. We're in the new world or the new normal, whatever you want to call it. But most contractors still need to be able to establish through the processes in their contract that was a trigger event that's listed in the contract, that they've given the right notifications, that they've got the right evidence. And frankly, being able to pull all that together at the same time as dealing with what we're dealing with in different countries, the lockdown, the problems of resources, the sickness, the isolation, the shield, all that kind of stuff is a big ask. And the contractors don't have the spare capacity to do it. The contract administrators don't have the expertise to kind of draw it together as well. So although I think the claims will happen, I think there's quite a big time lag, because at the moment, everyone's doing what Andy said. They're just getting on with the project because pretty much that's what people went into construction to do. They didn't go in for the paperwork. They didn't go in for the process. They didn't go in for the claims. Except you, Suzannah, they didn't go into it for the friction. They went into it for the sheer joy of building something that will change people's lives. That's what people want to do. So the fact that they now have to prove that they're late because of COVID is an irritation to them, because isn't it obvious? But contracts don't work on what's obvious. Contracts work on clear, simple processes. And I think particularly if they're working under a contract like NEC or FIDIT, which has deeming provisions, they really need to kind of get a clear head and get somebody to look at it and go, what should we have done? When should we have given notices? Can we still give notices if we haven't? Because you don't want to lose the right to the extra time or money that you're entitled to because of this event, because you haven't followed the processes. And I think this almost highlights the fact that once you've got a contract, you also need somewhere in your work, in your project huts or whatever, to have clear, documents that just say, if this happens, this is what we need to do, a flowchart approach, because that helps the parties to manage the project. And, all these processes that Andy was talking about, doesn't matter how prescriptive they are, they're there to suit the purposes of both parties. They're not one-sided. They help the parties to keep up to date, to make sure they've got up-to-date programs, budgets, schedules, ordering facilities, all that kind of stuff is really critical to a successful project. But it kind of comes across as sort of an irritation rather than actually also as important as the works themselves. So I think, what we need is processes that are easy to follow, that are timetabled and scheduled, that are clear and unambiguous, that don't have any grey areas, that don't allow one party to game it over the other, and that give the contract administrator the information they need to make clear, crisp decisions to bring the project into the next phase.
That really resonates with me, Sarah, because time and time again, I see the claims that have been put in during the currency of the project, and they do look like they've been an irritation to someone. They certainly don't contain what I, as a lawyer, then ultimately trying to fight a dispute, would want to see in them. And they probably didn't include enough to allow an engineer or someone to make a decision at that time. And then that means they do end up with someone like me having to fight them. But Andy, what do you think about the solution to that?
Well, I'm going to go back to my friends HKA and Arcadis and remind them what I said right at the beginning. One of the big levels of reasons for disputes are spurious, overinflated, opportunistic, and this is the big one, what Suzannah was just saying, unsubstantiated claims. So, exactly what we said, it's not a claim, it's not been put together. As Sarah said, it's been put together by somebody who views it as an irritation because they've actually got proper things to do on the project. So the first thing, and going back to the question about COVID, claims related to COVID, is make sure that you well, first of all, get all your notices in and all your obligations that you have to do in a situation, but make sure that when you submit your claim, it is a properly substantiated claim. It contains all the details, the examination of cause, of effect, of contractual or legal entitlement, and everything is substantiated so that when it goes to the contract administrator, they have got no, and this is the aim when you're preparing a claim, they have got no reason to say, no, your claim is rejected. And that avoids, sorry, Suzannah, people like yourself getting involved when we're settling claims at project level. And there is actually light at the end of the tunnel with regard to COVID. The contracts that I've examined, some of them standard forms of contracts, some of them sort of bespoke contracts, there is so far always been an entitlement to extension of time because of a pandemic, COVID. In some occasions, and possibly entitlement to claim some, if not all, of the costs. Now, we've been working on behalf of a couple of clients, and when COVID arose and we had to start looking at extension of time claims on behalf of those clients, we had to seriously think out of the box because COVID is different. Nobody's experienced this before. And the principal difference is, once we've established this entitlement to make a claim under the contract, is that most delays that occur on projects affect one or a few activities. We've got to build in the time to deal with a variation. We've got a delay because we didn't get access to the site, or we didn't get the drawings on time, all those good things. Now, think about your average program on an average project that has maybe thousands of activities. COVID affected a very, very big percentage of those. The supply chain overseas, delivery, getting the materials that were manufactured or the plant and equipment manufactured overseas onto a ship and through the customs. It affected mobilization of personnel, of the workforce, of specialist people, and we had a big problem. One of the projects was testing and commissioning engineers that need to come from the factories that had manufactured the turbines and the equipment and the rest of it, couldn't travel. Or when they did try to travel, they were locked down in isolation for 14 days. So when we prepared the claims on behalf of our clients, we had to have a completely different approach to proving cause, effect, not so much entitlement, but the delay analysis that we produced had to deal with hundreds and hundreds of activities. I'm going to blow our trumpet here, and it's tantamount to the people that we have working for us, in that the two claims that have been submitted and reviewed have both come back with awards of extension of time, and what's more than that, no contentions, no requests for further particulars, and they have resulted in awards for our clients. So a little bit of advertising there, but hey, I don't do these things for free.
Thank you. I know certainly in the early days when I was seeing a lot of notices for COVID, for force majeure, part of the problem that the contractors were facing in terms of putting together a meaningful notice that ticked the boxes, if you like, to allow the engineer to give it time, was that it was actually just not possible to anticipate what the delay to the completion date was going to be at that stage. And most contracts requiring you to evidence that it's going to affect the completion date. So what do you think? Is there anything we could do differently right into contracts, or formulate the project in a different way that will remove those sorts of battles or barriers?
Well, I think the difficulty with trying to tie contract administrators down is most of them don't know what the current contract says. So the more prescriptive we can be, maybe the less they will be able to follow it. But in some respects, if we could say that a typical claim for an extension should include this information. So rather than saying substantiation, we could actually be specific. What does it look like? What would it normally contain? What information do we absolutely have to have? What information can you give us if you've got it? And what can we leave until, say, later? So I think in this case, it would have been useful if the contractors could give notice, and then they could look and kind of almost give interim extensions of time to say, well, given that we've got a 4-week lockdown, for example, in some countries, then we've obviously know that the next 4 weeks is going to be difficult. After that, we can't tell. So we're going to have to make some preliminary assessments. And I know NEC allows you to do forecast or to state what your assumptions are. And I think some of that is good practice, because all these procedures aren't really to tie people in. They're to manage the project properly and give everyone the next step. And it's a bit like when you're given directions somewhere. Sometimes you don't actually need the full directions between your house and a cinema, should you be allowed to go to a cinema. But it could be that you just need the next 2 steps. And that's, I think, something that these procedures might look at in the future, is having a sort of an interim response when you've got significantly uncertain futures. Now, it's not true that for most of the events that you would expect these procedures to be triggered by currently, or before the pandemic, then we needed that. But actually in this situation, the volatility and uncertainty of the situation meant that we could have done with that sort of discretion to have an interim assessment and to just recognise that they've given us all that they can currently give us. There is no more.
Yeah. What do you think, Andy? Anything to add to that?
Of course. A couple of things, really. First of all, yes, the claims that we've been working on, we still don't know what the final effects of COVID are going to be on the project. So, yes, we've submitted interim claims and we've had awards based on those interim claims. But, you know, the contractors need to keep on updating them until the final effects can be calculated. It could well be. I mean, on one of the projects, they think they're going to finish anyway. They spent an awful lot of money in mitigation, and you know, hats off to our client for doing that. And I think the employer has recognised that, and that's possibly one of the reasons why there's been no sort of defence. I'd like to think it was because our claim was actually absolutely brilliant, but you know, there's been no resistance to it. I think the employers appreciated what the contractor's done. The other thing, one of the things that Sarah mentioned, and I really, even though we make a lot of our living through preparing claims on behalf of contractors, is I'm still a big proponent of claims avoidance, and we try to get involved in that. Unfortunately, people like ourselves get involved when the project's gone wrong and everybody's thrown the toys out of the pram and they've dug themselves a big hole that they can't get out of. If we get involved at the beginning of the project, we can help our clients, be they contractors or employers, to avoid claims. And this is what we are really very quite passionate about it. We are currently working with a government department in Africa. One of the things that I'm hoping we're going to be able to do, having identified quite a few problems that they are dealing with on their projects, it's a government department, so that there are a lot of projects going on, is the fact that their people have identified the fact that contractors don't know what a good claim looks like, smells like, feels like. So one of the suggestions we've made is that we include within the contract documents, not the conditions, but within the specifications probably, a description of what a claim for a variation should contain, what it should look like, what a claim for an extension of time should contain, what it should look like. The delay analysis should be done like this, and it should contain this, that, and the other, so that the contractors have got a good starting point of what they're expected to produce. Because the government department have said, look, we don't want to not pay our contractors. We just want to make sure that we're awarding a fair amount and we're not awarding too much. And if we don't know what a fair amount is, because the contractor has not got the experience, qualification, or skills to produce a proper claim, where are we going to go? And yes, possibly we've got to reject it because it's not been proven.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm conscious of time because I want to make sure we leave time for questions. So I'm going to move on to a final question. And that is, we've talked about how we can better set up projects through the drafting. But what about the actual planning and design phases? Is there anything we could do differently there to avoid disputes?
Well, we talked about this, and I think, you know, procuring it in a way that actually allows time for those processes. You know, tender periods are very short, which means nobody gets a chance to look at the contract. That's the last thing they're going to focus on. Then somebody has told the client the start date and the end date, and everything now focuses on that, because that becomes quite a visceral thing for the client to attach to. But the reality is that by putting more effort into the planning and the design and getting it ready before we start on site, we're more likely to have a successful project. And trying to concertina a whole load of activities into the shortest possible timescale is obviously a recipe for disaster. The Emirates Stadium in London, the Arsenal football ground, the board took a really brave decision one season that they weren't ready to start. And the fans around the world were clamouring for this new stadium. The funders and the investors and everybody else wanted this new stadium. And the board said, we're not ready. We don't have the information. But when they did start, they finished on time, on budget, to the right quality. They met all their business objectives, all their project outcomes were ticked. It was an extremely successful project, but they had to take some brave decisions not to go ahead until they had all that information. On the other hand, we've got public sector projects in the UK, and we've had independent reports following them. And a lot of them have said you started too soon, you didn't have the information you needed, you were led astray by consultants who saw you as a big fat purse of money. You didn't have control of this project. You were always on the back foot from the start. That's not going to result in a successful project. So for me, it's about upfront planning, because in the life cycle of an asset, the construction phase is a very small proportion of the whole asset life cycle, from the operation, demolition, all of that. So let's get that bit right by putting time up front to set up the right team, set up the right contract, and then we'll end up with an outcome that lasts for decades, that's of the right quality and does what the client wants it to do.
I guess that the Arsenal directors learnt a lot of lessons from being just down the road from the Wembley Stadium, Sarah, which was a complete disaster.
Well, the Arsenal Stadium was finished before the. I think it was interesting because the Wembley Stadium and the Olympic Stadium were done roughly the same time in the UK, and the Wembley Stadium was a disaster.
So a great object lesson is this is how to do it right, this is how to do it wrong. Fantastic example.
Andy, do you want to make just one closing remark, because then I'm going to wrap this up for questions?
Yeah, I think the topic of this discussion was signing the dotted line. Yeah, and I think if I've got one piece of advice to give to both contractors and contract administrators and employers, is recognise the value of properly qualified, properly experienced contracts managers, contracts administrators. They are just as important as your best architect, as your best cost consultant, and as your best engineer or project manager.
Thank you. Well, thank you, both of you, very much indeed. I said you were passionate, and I think everybody will believe me now. And it was every bit as enjoyable as I'd expected it to be. So thank you for that. There was a lot packed in there, but I think the key takeaways for me, Sarah, your message is loud and clear. The projects to stand half a chance of succeeding. Underlying contracts need to be accessible. And they need to be written in a way that can be understood by someone other than the lawyers drafting them. Roles and responsibilities also need to be extremely clear. And then, Andy, those people with those roles and responsibilities need to read the contract and implement them, with or without your book. And also, Andy, I think we probably would save quite a few of our legal battles on the content of notices, if people adopted your approach of thinking about the format that those claims should be in at the time of contracting and specifying that format at that outset as well. And of course, your points about having the right people to play the right part, the part that they're trained to play, is important too. Designers shouldn't be drafting contracts. And I certainly took away from you there that given high stakes, preparing claims should be done by specialists. Now, that could be you or me. But my favourite lesson from the discussion has probably got to be that bit at the end there, Sarah, because it's very much at the heart of many of the problem projects in the Middle East. It's not setting a completion date until the works have been planned and designed, because clients do get invested in completion dates. And then they take those unrealistic completion dates and expect contractors to meet them. And I think it's a root cause of many problems. So thank you again, both of you. Thank you, Andy and Sarah. There'll be some questions for you. So the floor is now open to questions.
Thank you very much, Suzannah. That was a very lively panel discussion. I must congratulate and compliment all the panelists for having a very wonderful and a light-hearted and a humorous kind of a discussion on a very dry subject. It's one of the most serious subjects about the contracts and the clauses and the roles and the obligations and all this, but you made it really very nice without losing the essence of the subject. That was really nice. So now it's the time for the question and answers. So let's move on to the questions. The first question we have is for Andy. How do we fix problems that we have with administering the contracts to avoid any kind of disputes?
Well, short and sharp answer. Firstly, make sure the contract's selected which is appropriate for the project. Secondly, ensure that the contract conditions are drafted by somebody who has the appropriate skill and experience. And I have to say, I'm sorry, I do work in an international environment, appropriate skills in the language which the contract is written. And thirdly, ensure that whether we are contracts administrators, engineers, architects, contractors, we have people deployed to the project who've got the appropriate skills, experience and training and qualifications to make sure that we do what we should do when proceeding with the project. Yeah, we perform our obligations in the right way.
That's wonderful. That's really great. And the second question also is coming to you, Andy. And this is a question which probably every person, every stakeholder who is involved in the construction activity and the field is thinking about. And this is about the COVID-related question, definitely. This is about the contracts that we are just about to enter into, what we can be doing to reserve our rights and documenting our position, especially with regards to the exceptional circumstances and the force majeure like the one that we are facing right now.
Okay, can I put my phone number on the screen?
That's very nice.
I actually think that the standard conditions of contract, certainly the ones that we've dealt with as a consultancy practice, particularly FIDIC, but some bespoke contracts that are used, similar contracts are used in certain type of projects, sort of deal with this sort of circumstances related to COVID, exceptional circumstances, force majeure, pretty well. And we've been successful in helping a couple of our clients to get awards of extension of time because there is a contract, there's something within the conditions of contract that allow them to claim for extensions of time. And we prepared the claims in the right way. As I said in the presentation, we had to think out of the box into how to change various standard ways of producing claims for extension of time to take into the exceptional circumstances of COVID, because it was the delays were such wide ranging. We had to come up with a way of demonstrating the effect of COVID on the completion date, but we were successful. And you know, the contracts that we were dealing with helped us to do that. So I don't think there is a need to start rewriting standard conditions of contract in case COVID happens in the future.
Okay, that's very valid. I think that's really makes sense as well. Moving on to the next question, and this question is directed at Suzannah. The disputes have always featured in construction projects. They are nothing new. But today's cost-sensitive clients, they demand that the parties focus on the project success and effectively avoid the disputes and resolve any unavoidable disputes efficiently. So what are some of the ways in which these objectives can be achieved?
Well, I think to start with, you need to start right at the beginning. And when you're entering into the contract, think about whether what is being agreed is actually feasible. can it actually be built to that, in that time scale? Can it actually be built to that cost? And if it can't, if they are unrealistic, there will be claims. So as a starting point, start off with something that's feasible. Secondly, once you know what's there is feasible, don't load all the risk on one party in the contract, unless you're going to give that party opportunity to price for that risk. Because otherwise, again, it creates an unrealistic scenario and there will be claims. But I would also suggest that perhaps parties think about the way they set up their contracts. And certainly here in the Middle East, it's typical to have traditional fixed price lump sum contracts. And when you have that, the commercial interests of the parties are not aligned. So think about whether there's a better way of doing it, like more of a collaborative contracting approach. So say a reimbursable contract with a pay and gain share element, so that you're aligning the parties' commercial interests. And taking that sort of approach will definitely reduce the likelihood of claims occurring in the first place. The second part of your question was, how do you then resolve the disputes if they are unavoidable? Well, I would say use escalation provisions in your contract so that you are going, up through an escalation process where an issue arises. So it may be dealt with senior people in the organisations first, and then it may move to another step, such as a formal process like an expert determination or adjudication or something like that. Do provide for that escalation, and don't just simply delete existing mechanisms and contracts as we usually see here. So for us, I mean, we typically will pick up a FIDIC, and the first thing we'll see when it comes to the dispute resolution clauses is that all that good stuff's just been struck out completely. So keep in mind that those quicker methods of dispute resolution can be very effective at resolving disputes as they arise and allowing the project to continue, but have some flexibility about what they might be.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's really makes sense, and that's very logical as well. Moving on to next question. This is to Sarah. And we observe that here, particularly in this part of the world, all the contracts, whether it's a lease contract of maybe 100,000 dirhams, or even multi-million dollar or dirham contracts, which are for the construction projects, they're all written in two languages. One is English and one is Arabic. And probably this is the same thing happening in different parts of the world as well. So the question here is that if a contract is written in more than one language, then which will be the official and control in the event of any conflict between the meaning interpretation of these two languages?
Well, it's a really good question. I've seen it on international projects throughout the world. And the reality is that one of those contracts should state that it is the official contract, and the other one is a translation. In the event of a conflict, then that language will prevail, and that will be the one that's interpreted by any of the tribunal or dispute resolution mechanisms that exist. I know in some countries they even have laws that say that the contract that was done in the language of the country that the project is taking place in will always take precedence. So it should be clear to the parties, because it's stupid to expect that to be easy to be resolved when you've got two contracts equally valid. One should be noted as a translation and not have the same priority as the original contract language.
Okay, wonderful. I think that clarifies to everyone about the limitation and the liability and the scope of the contracts as far as the language is concerned. The next question is to Suzannah, and this is about, again, COVID here, because since last 9 months when COVID has struck the world, every stakeholder in whichever capacity is wondering about how it could have been done better or how their rights could have been protected. So this question is about, when assessing the potential impact of COVID-19 on any project, what are some of the issues to consider outside of the contract?
Okay, outside the contract. So firstly, I suppose the things you're thinking of that are in the contract are the time and cost consequences. But do bear in mind that some laws also have provisions that will come into play when you've got a situation like force majeure. And the UAE is no exception. The UAE has a law that relates to force majeure, but it's, as it happens in the UAE, that won't apply if you've got express contractual provisions. Your contractual provisions will override. But then beyond that delay cost aspect of it in the contract, you also need to be thinking a little bit wider around the consequences. Now, some of these things might be picked up in the contract and they might not, but think about if the sites are closed down for any length of time, or in fact at all. Think about who's responsible for site security. Think about who's responsible if there's any degradation of the materials that are left on site, or the construction that's been done so far. Think about insurance, and think about things like worker welfare as well, and what are the responsibilities around that, either specifically under the contract, but more likely at law, and possibly for international contractors, even the law of their head offices and home countries, rather than the law in which the project is situated.
Wonderful. I think that really answers the question very well. And now we have the last question. This is addressed to Sarah. What remedies are available for the breach of construction contracts?
Well, there's a variety of remedies. Some of them will be set down by the laws of the country that apply to the contract. So there are statutory remedies in almost all jurisdictions, but there will also be express contractual remedies that the parties can agree, so they can get more time, they can get more money, they can have flexible procedures. We've talked about all those things already. And actually, I think parties really do need to think about what they would like the consequences to be, because to the extent that they're legally allowed to prescribe remedies, they're often quicker, cleaner, cheaper, and easier to use than they are to use other remedies, say for breach of contract or statutory remedies. So really, the parties need to think beyond the sort of initial phase where they're all falling in love with the project, to thinking about what happens if things do change. How would we like it to progress? Most construction contracts have a wide variety of remedies in already. So all change management provisions, extension of time provisions, monetary claim provisions, defects remedies, they're already a remedy for a breach of contract. So we can develop them and make them project specific, country specific, contract specific, and make sure that the parties really have the right range of remedies for a particular project. And if you compare and contrast, say, construction projects to engineering projects, the types of remedies available to the parties are vastly different. So we already have quite a lot of good inbuilt remedies that we need to think which ones are the most appropriate. Is this actually a construction project, or is this more an engineering project?
Wonderful. I think that's really great. And that sums up the question and the answer sessions for us. Thank you very much once again, Suzannah, Andy Hewitt, and Suzannah Newboult, Andy Hewitt, and Sarah Fox, for a very wonderful discussion that you had. It was very enlightening and enriching to all the participants. Thank you so much once again.